Today we are going to wrap up Unit 6 by talking about the Gilded Age. That takes us all the way from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 all the way until 1900, the turn of the century. So after Reconstruction ended in 1877 with that compromise that removed troops from the South, how did discrimination increase in the South? Well, Jim Crow laws were reestablished to restrict the civil and political rights of black people. For example, the grandfather clause, which we already talked about, the literacy test, the poll tax, all of these things were reinstituted in order to restrict the voting rights of black Southerners because there were no Northern troops to make sure this didn't happen anymore, occupying the South. You also had civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and George Washington Carver fighting for social change at this time. So this was a couple generations before the civil rights movement, before Martin Luther King Jr., and these guys really fought for civil and political rights for African Americans and social change in their own ways. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois said that they should, demand constitutional rights immediately, no compromises, whereas Booker T. Washington said that black people should get educated and basically earn it. All right, so there were different opinions, but they both fought for black equality. And then you had the court case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This is seen as one of the worst Supreme Court rulings of all time. This is what officially made segregation legal in the South. It said that segregation was indeed constitutional, that you could choose not to serve someone because of their race or anything like that. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson would later on be overturned about 50 years later with Brown versus Board of Education. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad is something we talked a little bit about last time, and something mentioned after the Bell work, with what made the Oregon Trail end. And the Transcontinental Railroad was just so incredibly monumental for our country. It was built largely by Chinese and Irish immigrants. If you look on the map, the area in the green and the red was built mostly by Chinese immigrants. The area in the blue was built mostly by Irish immigrants, and it ran from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way to San Francisco, California. So about 1,500 miles there. And this railroad was completed in 1869, just about 4 years after the Civil War ended. And the last spike that was driven into it was in Promontory Point, Utah, as you see where the blue and the red line meet there. And it was a golden spike that was nailed into it. And this is called the Wedding of the Rails. You see that in the picture at the top. And this was the official completion of this massive infrastructure project called the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, Canada had a similar railroad a little bit later. And remember, the Trans-Siberian Railroad went all the way through Russia, and that was 1891. Now, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad transformed the U.S. by creating a national economy, something we talked a little bit about last time. It also increased the population in the West, all right? You have a lot more people moving west of the Mississippi River because they can get there quickly and don't have to take a covered wagon and risk getting dysentery and dying on the way. It also led to the creation of new towns, new cities, and also new states in the West. If you've ever wondered why the Western states are so boxy and kind of square looking, whereas the Eastern states have a lot more dimension to the shape, it's because a lot of times these states were being created and formed so quickly that they just drew straight lines from this point to this point, and land surveyors just made it really, really simple so that people could settle in that territory. People could also now travel from coast to coast, really for the first time ever. It really transformed our country, made us seem like one country instead of a group of states. And you also have a lot of new industries, new job opportunities, and products being created and transported because of the railroad. The Homestead Act of 1862 was a really important piece of legislation. It encouraged Americans to move into the territory out west that America had recently acquired, both with the Louisiana Purchase and with the Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Oregon Treaty. All that territory that the U.S. got west of the Mississippi River A lot of that area was sold very inexpensively per acre to Americans. Now, some places gave land actually for free. For example, the Homestead Act gave settlers 160 acres of land for free, and that was a homestead on which they could start a farm. Right, so this was a really good deal for a lot of people, and it also relieved some of the burden on the cities because they had gotten too overcrowded. All right, so those are ways that the West and the Midwest became populated. Now, westward expansion had probably the most negative impact on Native Americans. You have Native Americans being forced off of their ancient tribal lands and moved to places called reservations, federal reservations. And if you look at that map there, all the area in the gray, those were reservations by 1890. You have a lot of wars being fought in the 1880s and 1890s between Native Americans and settlers because the Native Americans didn't want to give up the land that they liked to go to land they didn't want. And if you look at the places of these reservations, they're not all exactly prime real estate. You know, you have the northernmost point in Wisconsin here, okay, where it's cold all the time. You have this place in the middle of the desert here in New Mexico. All right, so not all this land was excellent land, you know, not places that people are dying to move to. And that's another reason why the Native Americans felt cheated. Okay, and there were a lot of battles you see on the map there, all those places where battles are marked, including the Battle of Little Bighorn. You have Wounded Knee, all right, all sorts of battles and shootings going on in the 1880s and 1890s. So Native American culture rapidly disappeared as settlers destroyed the buffalo population. A lot of the settlers would move out west and kill buffalo and just skin them and take their hide and then just leave the rest of the buffalo. Whereas the Native Americans used every part of the buffalo, but because they were being killed at such an amazing rate by the settlers, the buffalo population declined. And railroad companies began to take their land. A lot of the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads went through former Indian territory, and that was taken away from them. So the last president we talked about was Rutherford B. Hayes. Remember, he was elected against Samuel Tilden as a part of the Compromise of 1877, since neither one of them received enough electoral votes to win the actual election. After Rutherford B. Hayes came a guy named James A. Garfield. Now, what's important about Garfield is he didn't even serve for a full year. He only served from I think it was March of 1881 until September of 1881 because he was assassinated after serving as only a few months as president. So he was the second president to be assassinated. Sadly, hopefully there will never be another one. So when he was assassinated, his vice president Chester A. Arthur took office, and he was not seen as a great president. He was seen as someone who was put into the role of vice president because he knew James A. Garfield and was friends with him, and it just wasn't all that great. And when Garfield died, of course, Arthur was thrust into this job that he was not prepared for. He was much more interested in throwing these lavish parties than he was in actual governing. Okay, so a lot of people did not like that system of basically appointing someone you knew instead of someone who was qualified. And after Chester Arthur came Grover Cleveland. Now, what's special about Cleveland is he was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, meaning he served as president for one term, then someone else was president, and then he came back and won another election after that and served for 4 more years. Okay, so he served from 1885 to 1889, then 4 years off while someone else was president, and then he served again from 1893 to 1897. So he was our 22nd and our 24th president, both. So whenever you think of how many presidents we have, well, Donald Trump is number 45. But really, there have only been 44 people, 44 individuals to serve in the office of the presidency because Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms. The person who served in between Cleveland's terms was Benjamin Harrison. He was the 23rd president. And his most lasting legacy is something he passed called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this limited big businesses and monopolies really for the first time in U.S. history. After Cleveland's second term in office, William McKinley won the presidency. And he was president during the Spanish-American War, something we'll talk about in just a minute. And he was also assassinated in 1901. All right, so you have two presidents being assassinated fairly soon between each other. Once again, very sadly, that happened. But yes, he was the third president to be assassinated. Fourth and final was John F. Kennedy. So the years 1877 to 1900 were called the Gilded Age in America. That's a term that Mark Twain coined, the Gilded Age. And if something is gilded, that means it's nice and gold and shiny and pretty on the outside, but on the inside, it's not like that at all. It has problems. It's not as pretty as it looks on the outside underneath. So because with this increased immigration, urbanization, and industrialization that we'll talk about in a minute here, everything looked really positive and pretty on the surface in America. But underneath, things that people didn't always see, there was a whole lot of corruption and a lot of suffering. So Mark Twain called this the Gilded Age because he said that America is kind of like fool's gold. It looks a lot better than it actually is. Now, there were both positive and negative impacts of industrialization on the United States. We talked about the Industrial Revolution. We know what happened, but not all of the effects of industrialization were positive, just like with most things in history. You take the good with the bad, had both positive and negative results. Some positives, you have new inventions and technology really impacting America positively. It provided new jobs. It provided economic growth for the country. However, it also led to more pollution. It led to child labor, and it led to safety hazards in the factories. So you have a lot of people dying in the factories and not being treated well because of this rapid industrialization. It's growing faster than laws can keep up. Now, there are a group of people during the Gilded Age called the robber barons. Okay, some others called them captains of industry, but robber barons is the term we use here. And they were businessmen and CEOs who got very, very, very wealthy due to laissez-faire economics. All right, what laissez-faire means is hands off. It means that the government is not going to get involved whatsoever with the economy. They're not going to put any type of regulations on it. 100% free market. That meant the government could not interfere whatsoever with the economy. Total hands off. Now, the robber barons were able to get incredibly rich because of the laissez-faire economy. And these men usually paid their workers very, very little because they didn't have to. And they became multimillionaires in the process by capitalizing on these new industries. So they were brilliant guys. I don't want to paint them as villains whatsoever, but it was because of the laissez-faire economics that you had you had so much wealth among the robber barons, whereas most of their workers lived in really bad poverty. So the businesses of the robber barons were mostly monopolies. Okay, and this what a monopoly is. I know it's called a board. There's a board game called Monopoly, but what a monopoly is in business, that's when one company controls an entire industry, or is the only producer of a certain good or service. All right, so imagine if there was only one company in the world that made cell phones. All right, if there was only one company in the world that made cell phones, how much could they sell a cell phone for? As much as they want, because people want cell phones. And when there's no competition between Apple and Android and Samsung and these other companies, then prices will go really high because people know that they can sell them at such high prices because people have nowhere else to get a cell phone. So because there was lack of competition with a lot of the robber barons' companies, it led to very unfair prices. For example, John D. Rockefeller, you may have heard of Rockefeller Center, Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. He had a monopoly on oil refineries. He owned pretty much every single oil refinery in the entire country, which meant that he could set whatever price he wanted, and he did, and he became the richest person in America at the time. You have a guy named Andrew Carnegie, who was actually from Scotland, but he moved to America, and his industry was steel. He had a monopoly on the steel industry for a while. You have J.P. Morgan, who was into banking. If you ever heard of J.P. Morgan Chase, it's a credit card. And then Cornelius Vanderbilt, he had kind of a monopoly on railroads in a certain part of the country. And these men were robber barons. So that's industrialization in the Gilded Age. And another category in the Gilded Age is immigration. Okay, so immigration in the Gilded Age in the U.S. went up dramatically. If you see that chart there of the number of immigrants coming into the country per year, you see it was very, very low in the 1820s and 1830s, got a little bit higher in the 1840s and 50s, dipped a little bit in the 1860s because of the Civil War, and then started to increase a lot. And especially in the 1890s, you see this huge spike right here during the end of the Gilded Age. So the U.S. population went from 40 million to 70 million in 30 years. All right, from 1870 to 1900, it nearly doubled in size. And most of that growth was due to immigration. It wasn't just because people were having a lot of babies. It's because people were immigrating from mostly from Europe and from China. Most of the immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe as well as China, whereas before this, most immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe. So the main entry point for European immigrants was Ellis Island in New York City. That's right next to the Statue of Liberty, which is on Liberty Island, right next to Ellis Island. And then the main entry point for Asian immigrants was Angel Island in San Francisco, right? So that's where most of the immigrants came through before they would go and settle down in a city somewhere. Now, the reason why so many immigrants came to the U.S. during the Gilded Age is really because of economic opportunities, all right? You have a lot more economic opportunity in America than you do really anywhere else in the world. Also, some people were fleeing religious persecution and they wanted to come someplace that had freedom of religion like America, so they were kind of like the Pilgrims. And there were a lot of problems going on in the old world, like wars and famine. Remember, the Irish came over here in a large number in the 1840s because of the potato famine. Well, some other wars and famines were going on elsewhere in the old world. And a lot of Americans didn't really like these new immigrants at the time. And there are two major reasons why a lot of native-born Americans were skeptical about immigrants coming into our country. The first one is understandable. The second one is not quite as understandable. But the first reason was job competition. If you have a lot of immigrants who don't have much money coming into your country, they're willing to work for a lot less, whether or not their work is the same quality as yours. And so there was that kind of job competition that Americans did not want. And then the other one was based a little bit more in prejudice, and those are cultural differences. Okay, the people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe were mostly Catholic, mostly had darker skin, and of course Asians look a little bit different, have a different culture as well. So some Americans did not like that because of the cultural differences and didn't feel like they could assimilate into our country. So the working situation for most new immigrants in American cities at this time was not good at all. Most worked in factories that were very unsanitary, not really clean. They were also very unsafe. A lot of safety hazards because there were zero safety regulations whatsoever to businesses and factories. And it was also unfair to the workers, especially to the immigrants. A lot of them got ripped off. They would work 12-hour days for just like $1 because there was no minimum wage. There was no real competition because of monopolies. Labor unions were created in order to collectively bargain with robber barons. Have you heard the phrase, there's power in numbers, right? If just one immigrant would come up to his boss and say, hey, I'd like a raise, he's less likely to get it than if 100 or 200 or 300 of them would come together and collectively bargain as a union. So they would bargain with the robber barons and the management for safer working conditions, for higher wages, for fewer working hours, and also for an end to child labor. Now, the thing about unions is that sometimes when they went on strike, which means they wouldn't work until their demands were met, sometimes it was peaceful, sometimes it was violent. Now, the peaceful strikes were almost always successful, but when the strikes turned violent, they were always unsuccessful. And you can probably understand why that is. If you own a company and your own workers are enacting violence against you or other employees or the management, you're not going to think they deserve a raise. You're not going to think they deserve fewer working hours or better working conditions or whatever their demands are. But whenever they're being peaceful and respectful about it, you're going to think, okay, maybe they deserve it since they can act like adults. There was a group of journalists at the time called muckrakers, and their goal, their vision was to expose the corruption of businesses and these political machines that were pretty much running entire cities through their manipulation and control of the immigrants. All right, so we talked about the industrialization of the Gilded Age, the immigration of the Gilded Age, and the third concept here to know about is the urbanization in the U.S. during the Gilded Age. Okay, so urban is the opposite of rural. Urban means cities, and during the Gilded Age, cities in the U.S., or urban centers as we could call them, grew at a very, very rapid pace. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons was because of immigration. Most immigrants moved to the cities, very few moved to the country. And the second reason why cities were growing at a fast pace was because of the mechanization of agriculture. You have machines being used on the farms, so you don't need as many workers on the farms. All right, so people would move to cities and factories where their labor was needed. Now, the cities that grew the most were in the Northeast. You have cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, really growing at a very fast rate, and then also cities in the Midwest like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. Now, the first ever skyscrapers were built during this time, and that's because there was really nowhere to build but up. Okay, the cities were so crowded, so cramped because of the urbanization that you just had to build up because you couldn't build out anymore. And this rapid urbanization led to cities becoming very, very overcrowded, which caused a number of problems. One of the problems was lack of sanitation, which caused disease. Okay, if you have that many people living in a cramped place, okay, you don't really have sophisticated plumbing then like you do now. You can imagine how filthy an inner city can get and how it would be very easy to catch a disease. Also, fire risks. Because of the laissez-faire economics, there were no regulations to make sure that buildings had fire escapes, and a lot of people would die sometimes whenever a fire would break out because it was really tough to get out of a cramped building. There's also an increase in crime. When you have so many people living close together, especially in big cities, that usually leads to an increase in crime. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the Spanish-American War, and this happened in the late 1800s, mostly in the country of Cuba, the island nation of Cuba. All right. So to understand this, first we have to remember that back in the early 1800s, from 1800 to 1830, almost every single Latin American country gained independence from their European colonizer. Remember, Haiti gained independence from France, Brazil gained independence from Portugal, most of the rest of the Latin American countries gained independence from Spain, et cetera, et cetera. And they continued to gain independence so that by the late 1800s, really the only place left in Latin America under European control was Cuba. It was one of the last strongholds of Europe in the New World. And Cuba wanted independence from Spain, okay, the country who still controlled them at the time. They wanted independence just like every country around them had, and the U.S. wanted to help. They wanted to help Cuba gain its independence for a couple of reasons. First, remember the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. wanted European out of the Western Hemisphere, and also we wanted an ally in Cuba and to have a little bit more control over the region in that way. Now, Spain naturally did not want to lose Cuba, and the U.S. was ready to go to war over it. And that led to the Spanish-American War. Okay? In 1898, it was a very short war, but still a pretty important one. In 1898, you have an American ship called the USS Maine. Okay? And the USS Maine exploded in a harbor in Cuba, in Havana Harbor. Now, if we don't really like Spain because they have Cuba and we want Cuba to be independent, it would be very easy for us to blame Spain for this. And that's exactly what happened. The United States blamed the Spanish for the deaths of those American sailors and said Spain is to blame, remember the Maine. You see on that paper up there, it says destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Now, there was no evidence whatsoever that Spain had blown up our ship. Could it have been Spain? Yeah, it could have been. But the point is there was no conclusive evidence. But President McKinley used this as a reason to go to war with Spain, okay, making us all believe that it was conclusive, that Spain did this to us, and therefore we need to go to war with them. So this was the Spanish-American War. It did not last very long, just a couple of months. You had a series of battles, including one in the Philippines, one in Guam. You had the Battle of San Juan Hill, which made Theodore Roosevelt famous, when he charged up the hill. with his group of Rough Riders, the cavalry. But after several battles here that mostly went in the way of the United States, okay, the U.S. won most of the battles over these couple of months, and finally the Treaty of Paris of 1898 was signed. And this ended the Spanish-American War. And what resulted from this treaty was that the U.S. took control of the Philippines, which you see right here on this map. They took control of Puerto Rico, which is still an American territory. They took control of Guam, which is still an American territory as well. And then Cuba did not become an American territory, but it became independent. And with that, Spain left the Americas and went back to Europe. So this really solidified the United States as a major world power and the major world power of the Western Hemisphere. Okay? It kind of solidified the Monroe Doctrine that we control all of the Americas. All right, so that leads us into the year 1900 with the turn of the century, what we call the Progressive Era. Okay, and we're going to start our next unit after Christmas on that.